That morning, I sat in the courtroom as the only person who knew exactly how this pathetic play would end. My stepmother sat exactly 12 feet away, wearing her fake tears like expensive jewelry while telling the judge I had entirely lost my mind. Our relatives leaned toward her, but I was not there to plead my innocence. I was only waiting for the exact moment the judge would remove his glasses and realize her documents were pure legal forgery. My name is Delilah Hudson. The air inside the Davidson County Chancery Court was heavy and tasted of floor wax and stale coffee. It was a Tuesday morning in Nashville, the kind of morning where the humidity outside choked the breath from your lungs. But inside this room, the temperature was kept at a freezing and calculated chill. The mahogany benches were hard. The lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving. It was the perfect stage for an execution. My execution. Sabrina Vale Hudson sat exactly 12 feet to my left. My stepmother. She wore a modest navy dress. The fabric was expensive, but the cut was designed to make her look smaller and more fragile than she actually was. She was applying for a temporary emergency conservatorship over me. The legal term sounded clinical, but the translation was simple. She wanted the court to declare me mentally unstable. She wanted the judge to strip away my autonomy. More specifically, she wanted to rip the voting rights for Hudson Terminal Holdings right out of my hands. Her lawyer was Dean Ralston. He stood at the podium like a priest delivering a eulogy for someone he secretly despised. His suit was tailored to an inch of its life. His voice was a practiced baritone designed to project reason and deep sorrow. He began painting the portrait of my supposed madness. I listened to Dean drone on about my father. Graham Hudson. He spoke the name as if he had actually known the man. He talked about the empire my father built from dirt and diesel fuel. He described the sprawling logistics network, the massive shipping containers, the thousands of moving parts that kept the region alive. And then he pointed at me. He described me as the weak link, the broken daughter who could not handle the pressure of the crown. He told the court that I was a hazard to my own family. He used words like unstable and grieving and erratic. He wove a narrative of a daughter completely broken by the sudden death of her father, a daughter who was now actively dragging her father's massive industrial legacy down into the mud. He gestured toward me with an open palm as if presenting a wounded bird to the judge. He claimed my grief had morphed into a severe cognitive decline. Every lie was wrapped in velvet. Sabrina did not accuse me of malice. She accused me of incompetence caused by sorrow. That was her brilliance. If she called me a thief, I could show bank statements. By calling me crazy, she forced me to prove a negative. How do you prove your mind is entirely your own when the people who are supposed to love you are swearing under oath that it is gone? I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded neatly in my lap. The leather chair squeaked if you moved, so I simply stopped moving. I focused my eyes on the edge of the judge's desk. Sabrina took over. She did not need a podium. She spoke directly from her seat, leaning forward to ensure the judge could see the precise glisten of moisture in her eyes. It was a masterclass in maternal panic. She lowered her voice to a tremulous whisper that somehow carried perfectly across the quiet room. She told the judge about the dates I had supposedly forgotten. She recounted a fabricated Tuesday where I wandered the house looking for my father. She listed the bills she claimed I had missed, the water bill, the property tax notices. She said my speech was disorganized. She claimed I had entirely lost my orientation of time. She painted a picture of a woman wandering blindly through her own life, incapable of distinguishing morning from night. She recounted a specific incident. She said I had called her at 3 a.m. asking why the freight trucks were not moving. She claimed I was crying hysterically about phantom contracts. It was a beautiful fiction. The details were so specific that anyone listening would assume they had to be true. Who would invent a story about a 3 a.m. phone call regarding logistics contracts? She dabbed the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue. She did not wipe. Wiping would ruin the makeup. She merely pressed the cotton to her skin to absorb the fake sorrow. I let her speak. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. I sat trapped inside my own silence and listened to the rhythmic thumping of my own heart. I was counting. Deep in my mind, I was looking at a calendar. There were exactly 11 days left. 11 days until the final rezoning vote for the family freight yard took place. That was the only timeline that mattered. Everything happening in this room was a calculated distraction designed to separate me from that single upcoming moment. Sabrina needed me legally paralyzed before the 11th day arrived. I allowed my gaze to drift toward the gallery behind the wooden railing. The audience had been carefully curated. Sabrina had brought her own cast of supporting characters to sell the tragedy. Aunt Marcy sat in the second row. She had her hands clasped tight against her chest, radiating a toxic mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Beside her sat my two cousins, looking suitably somber. They were wearing dark colors as if attending a second funeral. A few seats down was one of the senior board members from Hudson Terminal Holdings. His presence was a tactical strike. Sabrina wanted the company leadership to witness my alleged mental collapse firsthand. I felt the eyes of the board member drilling into the back of my neck. He was taking notes, mental calculations of how fast the stock would plummet if the heiress apparent was committed to a psychiatric facility. Sabrina was not just stealing my freedom today, she was actively destroying my professional reputation in real time. She was salting the earth so that even if I survived this hearing, I would never command the respect of the board again. And scattered around them were a handful of Sabrina's acquaintances. Women from her charity luncheons and country club dinners. They were brought in as props. Background extras hired to nod in silent agreement while the wicked stepmother played the martyr. At the front of the room, Judge Hal Reed presided over the circus. He leaned back in his high leather chair, resting his chin on his knuckles. He looked exhausted. He had the deeply lined face of a man who had spent 3 decades listening to spouses lie to each other and business partners stab each other in the back. His eyes darted between Sabrina and me. He maintained a cold and impenetrable neutrality. He gave nothing away. He just listened to the poison spilling into the record. The air in the room grew tighter. The pressure was building. Everyone was waiting for the snap. They were all waiting for me to break. They wanted me to burst into tears. They wanted my voice to shake. They wanted me to stand up and scream that Sabrina was a liar. They prayed for me to lose my temper and slam my fists against the table. Any sudden movement or loud denial would be the final nail in my coffin. An emotional outburst would be immediately classified as hysteria. If I fought back with anger, Sabrina would win the war in exactly 3 seconds. She would look at the judge with terrified vindication, and the gavel would fall. I could feel Aunt Marcy holding her breath. I could see Dean Ralston shifting his weight, ready to interrupt my breakdown. Sabrina looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, silently begging me to explode. Instead, I took a slow and measured breath. I inhaled the freezing air of the courtroom and let it settle in my lungs. I uncrossed my ankles. I placed my palms flat on the wooden table in front of me and pushed myself up. My chair did not scrape against the floor. I stood tall. The courtroom fell entirely silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I reached down with my right hand and calmly adjusted the single button of my charcoal blazer. The tiny metallic click echoed sharply. I looked directly at Judge Reed. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. My voice was low, even and smooth like polished glass. I stated that I did not wish to offer a rebuttal just yet. I informed the court that I preferred to wait until my stepmother had entirely finished her statements. I requested that she be allowed to place every single one of her accusations completely on the official record and under the strict penalty of perjury before I spoke a single word in my own defense. The silence shattered into a tense and heavy vacuum. Sabrina stopped breathing. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Her perfectly manicured hand twitched on the table. Her eyes darted rapidly toward Dean Ralston, searching for a life raft. The tremulous victim routine vanished, replaced instantly by the sharp, panicked glare of a predator, realizing the trap they built was suddenly facing the wrong direction. It was the very first time she faltered. And we both knew it. I am 33 years old, and my childhood was not defined by soft lullabies or neighborhood playgrounds. My earliest and most vivid memories are permanently coated in the thick metallic scent of motor oil, heavy machinery, and raw diesel exhaust. While other little girls were being read fairy tales before bed, I fell asleep to the rhythmic, distant thumping of massive freight loaders echoing in my ears through the open window. My father built his sprawling empire entirely with his own calloused hands and a stubborn, absolute refusal to ever accept defeat. He transformed a rusting, forgotten loading dock on the gritty, undesirable edge of Nashville into a monstrous beast of transfer yards and industrial warehouses. Dinner in our household was never served at 6 o'clock sharp like a normal family. Dinner was served whenever the final 18-wheeled truck of the evening safely cleared the outbound way station. We ate cold roast beef in the dimly lit kitchen, while he spread thick, grease-stained transport contracts across the table, tracing the complicated national logistics routes with the back of a silver pen. I learned how to read by sounding out the bold names of national shipping conglomerates printed on the sides of corrugated metal boxes. That was the unshakable foundation of my entire life. A foundation built strictly on poured concrete, reinforced steel, and honest, exhausting sweat. Then that solid foundation cracked right down the middle. I was away at college, buried deep in heavy economics textbooks, when the phone rang with the devastating news. A brain aneurysm does not give you any polite warnings. It does not negotiate for more time or allow you to say goodbye. It just takes everything in a single violent instant. My mother was standing by the kitchen counter making coffee one minute and completely gone the next. Her sudden tragic absence left a vast, echoing void in our home. It created a deep structural fissure in the plaster of our family dynamics that no amount of expensive wallpaper or fresh paint could ever truly cover up. My father did not know how to process the devastating loss of the only woman he had ever truly loved. So he threw himself entirely into the shipping company, trying desperately to pave over his immense grief with fresh black asphalt and endless warehouse expansion files. The house grew incredibly silent and unbearably cold for a very long time. Exactly 2 years later, that heavy, suffocating silence was finally broken by the sharp, authoritative click of designer heels against our polished hardwood floor. Sabrina Vale stepped into our fractured lives and completely changed the atmospheric pressure of every room she entered. She used to work in high-end residential home staging for luxury real estate markets. That specific profession made perfect sense to me because her entire existence was an exercise in carefully curated optics and psychological manipulation. She possessed an uncanny, almost terrifying ability to walk into a dull, lifeless room and instantly make everyone believe their lives were a little bit more beautiful just because she aimed her perfectly white smile in their direction. But she did not bring actual genuine warmth to our grieving home. She brought a flawless magazine-ready presentation. She ruthlessly replaced the worn, comfortable furniture my mother had chosen with sharp, modern, minimalist pieces that looked absolutely stunning in photographs, but felt completely impossible to sit on comfortably. Sabrina never once set foot on the actual dirt of the freight yards. The gravel, the mud, and the industrial dust would have ruined her expensive designer shoes and offended her delicate sensibilities. But she understood a fundamental, brutal truth about how power operates in the modern American corporate landscape. She knew that true power does not always live inside the sterile glass walls of a corporate boardroom. More often than not, it lives in the intimate, dimly lit setting of a private dining room. Sabrina meticulously took complete control of our entire social perimeter. She orchestrated the lavish investor dinners at our home, serving ridiculously expensive imported wines and effortlessly commanding the flow of the evening conversation. She completely took over my father's calendar, acting as the ultimate velvet-roped gatekeeper. If a senior logistics executive, a city politician, or even an old family friend wanted to reach Graham Hudson, they had to successfully navigate through the polite but ironclad maze of Sabrina's social schedule. She managed him not as an equal life partner or a loving husband, but as a highly valuable corporate asset to be fiercely protected from outside influences. Under her careful direction, we became the picture-perfect modern American family draped heavily in vast wealth and privilege, masking our deep, unresolved emotional traumas with polite dinner party conversation and perfectly tailored clothes. Despite the luxurious facade of the massive estate where Sabrina hosted her endless charity galas, the true crown jewel of our family wealth was not the house itself. The real prize was a massive stretch of ugly, uneven dirt and gravel, located in East Nashville, 38 acres of prime industrial freight yard. To an untrained outsider driving past it, merely looked like a depressing wasteland of stacked shipping containers, overgrown noxious weeds, and rusted chain-link fences. But the city of Nashville was expanding at a violent, unprecedented speed. A new major commercial transit line and highway expansion were being aggressively proposed by the city planners right alongside our southern property boundary. We were waiting on a critical city council rezoning vote that was rapidly approaching. If the local government approved the zoning change, that ugly patch of dirt would instantly transform into an absolute goldmine. The valuation of the land would multiply exponentially overnight, reaching figures that could rival major corporate acquisitions. It was exactly the kind of staggering generational wealth that makes perfectly rational people lose their minds and turn viciously on their own blood. My father was a man built of heavy machinery and unbreakable logistics, but his physical heart was rapidly failing him. He went into the top-tier hospital for a highly complex heart valve replacement surgery, and the medical complications immediately began to cascade one after another. But before the sterile hospitals, the glowing heart monitors, and the endless white rooms took over his final exhausting days, he did something very quietly and very deliberately. He picked up his phone and called his private estate attorney, bypassing the firm Sabrina usually recommended. He secretly restructured all the critical inheritance documents and the living trust. He knew exactly the kind of ambitious, ruthless woman he was married to, and more importantly, he knew exactly what I was fully capable of handling. He left Sabrina the sprawling luxury house and a remarkably generous financial allowance to ensure she would never have to work a single day for the rest of her natural life. But the shipping company was his true life's work and legacy. The voting rights for the massive corporate holdings and the absolute final decision-making power over those 38 acres of dirt were legally bound to me and me alone. He tried his best to keep it a complete secret, but a massive house run by someone as calculating as Sabrina Vale has no true secrets. One quiet evening while my father was resting heavily medicated upstairs, Sabrina slipped quietly into his private locked study. I know this for an absolute fact, because the internal security logs on the home internet server showed the heavy oak door opening shortly after midnight. She found the updated legal files hidden deep in his bottom desk drawer. She took high-resolution photographs of the amended trust documents with her smartphone in the pitch-black dark. The metadata from the home network activity painted a very clear and completely undeniable picture of her midnight discovery. From that exact night forward, a fundamental psychological shift occurred within her. The carefully crafted soft mask of the devoted, deeply worried wife slipped right off her face and shattered on the floor. She no longer acted like a vulnerable woman terrified of losing the older man she deeply loved. She began moving, operating, and calculating exactly like a ruthless corporate raider who had just realized she was about to be cut entirely out of the most lucrative real estate business deal of her entire life. She started looking at me not as a grieving stepdaughter in need of comfort, but as the absolute only obstacle standing between her and an unimaginable fortune. Sabrina did not construct this elaborate guillotine by herself. An ambitious woman who operates entirely on optics requires a partner who operates comfortably in the shadows. His name was Nolan Voss. He was a commercial industrial land broker who wore custom suits that cost more than a standard mortgage payment and possessed a practiced smile that never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. Their partnership was not merely a recent development born from my father passing away. The digital breadcrumbs and quiet whispers in the local real estate circuit suggested they had been intimately involved long before the hospital machines ever flatlined. They were sharing expensive hotel rooms and sending encrypted messages while my father was still legally drawing breath. Their mutual objective was incredibly straightforward and ruthlessly efficient. It was a classic corporate hostile takeover disguised as a tragic family crisis. If I could be formally declared mentally incompetent by a sitting judge, my temporary conservator would immediately inherit my corporate voting rights. Sabrina would suddenly hold the ultimate veto power over Hudson Terminal Holdings. And with that unbridled power, she and Nolan planned to force the company to sell the massive freight yard for absolute pennies on the dollar. They had already set up a shadow corporation specifically designed to swallow the land right before the city council finalized the highly anticipated rezoning vote. Once the city officially approved the new transit lines, their hidden company would instantly flip the property and walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars, while the Hudson legacy was left holding an empty paper bag. But to convince a conservative judge that a perfectly sane woman needed to be stripped of her legal autonomy, you cannot just claim she is terribly sad. You have to prove she is fundamentally dangerous to the survival of the business. Sabrina needed to manufacture a severe financial crisis. She needed the corporate ledgers to look like they were violently bleeding out under my new supposed leadership. To accomplish this grand illusion, she began systematically siphoning cash directly out of the primary operating fund. She did not take massive glaring sums that would instantly trigger an external bank audit. She bled the accounts using 1,000 tiny deliberate cuts. She established a network of 3 completely fabricated shell companies. She named them Red Hollow Environmental, Pine Harbor Site Control, and Slate Anchor Advisory. The names were brilliantly boring. They sounded exactly like the kind of tedious bureaucratic vendors a massive industrial shipping yard relies on every single day to keep the gates open. Sabrina and Nolan funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the family business by disguising the theft as routine operational expenses. Red Hollow Environmental submitted heavy monthly invoices for toxic soil remediation and chemical spill cleanup. Pine Harbor Site Control billed us continuously for perimeter security upgrades and high-tech surveillance monitoring that simply never existed. Slate Anchor Advisory charged exorbitant retainer fees for federal transportation compliance consulting. If an auditor glanced quickly at the balance sheets, everything looked perfectly normal. Heavy industry requires heavy maintenance. A single payment of $45,000 for a comprehensive soil toxicity report does not raise any immediate red flags when your company parks hundreds of leaking diesel trucks on top of a giant dirt lot. But Sabrina did not stop at simply stealing the cash reserves. She needed the internal financial damage to reflect directly onto my daily management skills. So she began intentionally sabotaging the mundane administrative machinery of the company. She intercepted the incoming mail and purposefully delayed our quarterly state tax payments. She buried small but critical vendor invoices at the bottom of her locked desk drawers, causing our local supply accounts to fall into immediate delinquency. She let the monthly utility bills for the secondary storage warehouses sit unpaid until the final disconnect notices were officially printed and mailed out. When the senior company accountants generated the monthly internal reports, the resulting picture was absolutely disastrous. The cash reserves were mysteriously draining away. The vendors were angry and threatening to halt services. The state government was sending aggressive penalty notices for late taxes. And who was sitting at the top of the organizational chart while the ship was supposedly sinking? I was the grieving daughter who had just been handed the heavy keys to the kingdom. Sabrina successfully created a thick paper trail that painted me as a grossly negligent manager who was entirely overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the business. Financial sabotage was only the first half of her grand strategy. The second half required a complete psychological assassination of my character within our own family circle. She took fragments of my genuine grief and twisted them into a terrifying narrative of a woman completely losing her grip on reality. If I sat quietly on the back porch staring at the trees, because I missed my father, Sabrina would whisper to the housekeeper that I was experiencing severe catatonic episodes. If I forgot where I placed my car keys after a totally sleepless night, she documented it as an alarming cognitive lapse. She dug through my old text messages, taking completely innocent complaints about being tired or stressed, and presented them entirely out of context as undeniable proof of my mental unraveling. She weaponized the very normal tears I shed in the days immediately following the funeral, turning them into hard evidence of chronic emotional instability. She began orchestrating deeply concerning lunches with our extended family members. She would sit across from Aunt Marcy at an expensive downtown bistro, ordering sparkling water and leaning in close with a perfectly rehearsed look of absolute agony on her face. She would lower her voice and confess how terrified she was for my well-being. She would tell them how I was wandering the large house at all hours, how I was speaking in disjointed, nonsensical sentences, how I was slowly slipping away from the real world. Late at night, she would make frantic, tearful phone calls to my cousins and the company board members. She played the part of the desperate, loving stepmother who was watching her family crumble and did not know how to stop the bleeding. Her voice would break at the exact right moments. She sounded so virtuous. She sounded so incredibly brave. She convinced every single person in our social orbit that she was not trying to steal my rightful inheritance. She convinced them she was stepping up to actively save me from myself. She made them completely believe that stripping me of my civil rights was an act of profound maternal mercy. Nolan Voss was the architect of the real estate side, ensuring the trap was legally binding. He knew exactly which city officials to take to expensive steak dinners and which zoning board members needed quiet campaign contributions. He was the one who drafted the predatory purchase agreement for the 38 acres. The contract was a masterpiece of legal theft. It included buried clauses that would allow his shadow corporation to acquire the land for roughly 25% of its actual post-rezoning market value. And because Sabrina was aggressively positioning herself to be my legal conservator, she would be the one holding the pen when it came time to sign that disastrous contract on behalf of the company. They were moving incredibly fast. The velocity of their scheme was terrifying. Every single day, another $10,000 vanished into the dark void of Pine Harbor site control. Every single week, another critical late notice arrived in the mail, artificially inflating the false narrative of my incompetence. I watched them do it. I sat in the exact same house, ate at the exact same dining table, and quietly observed the two of them dismantling my family legacy piece by piece. The emotional isolation was the heaviest burden to bear. I could not tell Aunt Marcy the truth because Sabrina had already inoculated her with vicious lies. If I claimed my stepmother was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake environmental companies, I would sound exactly like the paranoid lunatic Sabrina claimed I was. The trap was so elegantly designed that any attempt to fight back using normal methods would only trigger the final mechanism. It was a brilliant, flawlessly executed conspiracy. She built a solid cage out of fraudulent invoices, delayed taxes, and perfectly acted sympathy. She locked me inside and confidently waited for the judge to throw away the key. But Sabrina made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. She spent so much time carefully constructing her fraudulent financial empire that she never bothered to look into what I actually did for a living before my father passed away. She assumed I was just a quiet, unassuming girl who wore dark sweaters and worked a boring, repetitive office job. She truly believed I was an easy, soft target who would simply collapse under the immense weight of her coordinated attacks. The profound irony of her entire plot was almost poetic. She spent months creating a complex maze of shadow corporations, fake invoices, and hidden bank transfers in order to convince the entire world I was going crazy. She had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman she was trying to manipulate was a seasoned professional in the exact field of forensic financial tracking. She was desperately trying to drown me in an ocean of fake paper, completely unaware that I had spent my entire adult life learning exactly how to breathe underwater. Sabrina looked at me and saw nothing but a dull gray shadow. She saw a quiet woman who preferred dark charcoal sweaters, flat shoes, and staying entirely out of the spotlight. She saw someone who spoke softly at family gatherings and never once argued over the dinner bill. In her eyes, my daily job was nothing more than tedious administrative filler designed to keep a spinster busy. She thought I was just a basic paper pusher who stared blankly at glowing spreadsheets until 5 o'clock in the afternoon and then went home to a quiet, empty room to water my houseplants. To someone like my stepmother, whose entire existence revolved around loud, aggressive displays of wealth and ruthless social dominance, a quiet woman was immediately synonymous with a weak woman. She fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of my silence. She thought my silence was the complete absence of a spine. She did not realize my silence was a deeply cultivated and highly dangerous professional asset. I was not a simple filing clerk. I was the senior data integrity lead at Peregrine Ledger Group. We were a highly specialized, invisible corporate intelligence firm that dealt exclusively in electronic discovery, forensic document tracking, and digital fraud investigation for massive high-stakes corporate litigation. When a major international chief executive officer suspected his own chief financial officer of embezzling $50 million through complicated offshore accounts, they did not call the local police department. They called my specific team. My entire professional life was dedicated to hunting ghosts hidden deep inside the machine. I spent my days dissecting invisible metadata, pulling apart encrypted server logs, and finding the microscopic digital fingerprints that arrogant thieves always leave behind. I knew exactly how to resurrect completely deleted emails from dead hard drives. I knew how to track a single fraudulent wire transfer through a dozen foreign banking systems. I was an apex predator who hunted quietly in the deep freezing waters of corporate data. It only took me exactly 72 hours after we buried my father to spot the very first anomaly. I was sitting at his old heavy mahogany desk reviewing the monthly expense reports from the previous quarter. My eyes have been professionally trained for over 10 years to recognize unnatural numerical patterns, and the documents sitting right in front of me were practically screaming. The printed invoice numbers from the 3 brand-new vendor companies were completely sequential. A legitimate environmental cleanup crew and an independent site security firm do not accidentally issue invoice number 401 and invoice number 402 on the exact same afternoon. It is a mathematical and statistical impossibility. Then I looked closely at the automated clearinghouse payment models. The routing sequences for the outgoing cash were perfectly identical. When I pulled the digital payment vouchers directly from the company server, I immediately checked the hidden file properties. The naming conventions for the portable document formats were far too synchronized. Every single file was titled using the exact same 8-digit date structure, followed immediately by a hyphen and a lowercase internal department code. They were clearly not generated by 3 entirely different external billing departments. They were generated by the exact same human hand sitting at the exact same computer keyboard. Any normal grieving daughter would have immediately marched straight into the living room, thrown the forged papers onto the glass coffee table, and demanded a tearful confession. But I knew far better than that. Direct verbal confrontation is the absolute worst weapon you can possibly use against a narcissist. If I showed Sabrina my hand too early, she would simply feign absolute ignorance. She would blame a careless bookkeeping error made by a junior staff member. Then the very second my back was turned, she would permanently wipe the server logs, physically destroy the local hard drives, and completely change her theft methodology. Worse yet, she would take my righteous anger and twist it violently against me. She would immediately tell everyone in our social circle that I was experiencing a paranoid manic episode brought on by intense grief. If I yelled, she would win the war, so I did the hardest, most painful thing a person can do when they know they are being actively robbed. I smiled, I nodded, and I played completely dumb. I actively leaned into the pathetic, fragile character she had written for me. I desperately needed her to feel overwhelmingly confident, because a confident criminal is always a sloppy criminal. I quietly packed up my personal belongings and moved completely out of the massive family estate. I leased a tiny cramped apartment on the dreary industrial side of town. I stopped driving the expensive luxury sports utility vehicle my father had bought me and intentionally purchased an old rusted sedan that sputtered violently whenever it idled. I completely cut off all outward signs of my usual consumer spending. I stopped getting my hair professionally cut. I wore baggy, wrinkled clothing. I wanted the entire world to look at me and see a deeply broken woman who was rapidly shrinking away from reality. The more I retreated into this pathetic, miserable shell, the bolder Sabrina became with her fraudulent bank transfers. She truly thought I was too depressed to even open my own mail, let alone audit a multi-million-dollar freight company. During the bright hours of the day, I was the tragic, broken daughter. But late at night, locked inside my tiny apartment, I went to war. I bought a cheap plastic folding table and turned my small living room into a digital command center. I bypassed the company firewall using backdoor administrative credentials my father had secretly given me 3 years ago. I began mapping out my own private, impenetrable chain of evidence. Every night at exactly 11 o'clock, I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and opened my encrypted laptop. I did not just look at the surface of the files. I looked at the dark matter hiding underneath. For example, one of the heavy invoices from Pine Harbor Site Control claimed to be officially generated back in January, but when I extracted the EXIF metadata from the digital document, it revealed a very different truth. The document was originally authored using a specific commercial word processing software update that was not officially released to the public until late March. Furthermore, the creator tag buried in the file properties belonged to a registered user named N. Voss. They were so incredibly arrogant they did not even bother to scrub their own digital footprints before uploading the fake bills to our accounts payable server. I painstakingly traced the Internet Protocol addresses used to approve the outgoing wire transfers. My father always approved transfers from his desktop computer at the main office, which possessed a static address. But these new rapid approvals were bouncing all over the city. One massive transfer approval originated from a high-end luxury hotel downtown at the exact same time Sabrina was attending a highly publicized charity luncheon in their grand ballroom. Another approval pinged off a cellular data tower located less than half a mile from Nolan Voss and his private real estate brokerage firm. I pulled the state registration records for the 3 shell limited liability companies. I verified the digital signatures on the newly drafted vendor contracts and compared the hidden document version histories. I was slowly building an absolute fortress of pure, unadulterated data. I knew I could not bring this massive pile of evidence to a standard flashy corporate attorney. A loud, aggressive lawyer would immediately send a formal cease and desist letter, which would instantly tip Sabrina off and ruin the trap. I needed a legal sniper. That is exactly why I found Nina Barrett. Nina was a fiercely private litigation attorney who operated entirely out of a tiny, unmarked office above a local bakery. She did not wear expensive designer suits or boast about her trial win rate at country clubs. She was cold, meticulous, and possessed a terrifyingly precise understanding of evidentiary law. I only shared a small fraction of my findings with her during our very first meeting, just enough to mathematically prove I was not crazy. Nina instantly understood the assignment. She knew that this specific kind of war was not won by shouting loudly in a crowded room. It was won by quietly assembling a chain of evidence so incredibly heavy that it would completely break the neck of anyone who tried to lift it. We sat in her cramped office drinking cheap black coffee out of paper cups and formulated the final strategy. I explained my ultimate conclusion to Nina. I told her that merely exposing the stolen funds and stopping the bleeding was not nearly enough. If we just sued Sabrina for the stolen money in civil court, she would hire a massive team of expensive lawyers, drag the civil case out for 10 agonizing years, and eventually settle for a tiny fraction of what she actually stole. She would walk away bruised but essentially unpunished and wealthy. I did not want a quiet settlement. I wanted complete, total, absolute annihilation. To achieve that specific level of destruction, I needed Sabrina to confidently step into the center of a federal courtroom and lie directly to a sitting judge. I needed her to formally file the fraudulent legal documents herself. I needed her to raise her right hand, swear a binding oath to God, and condemn herself with her own words. The trap had to be entirely self-inflicted. The predator had to willingly step into the steel jaws, wearing her own expensive shoes, entirely convinced she was walking toward a massive feast. The days leading up to the official court date were a masterclass in psychological suffocation. I was forced to navigate my own life as if I were walking barefoot across a floor covered in shattered glass. The hardest part of this silent war was not tracking the stolen funds. The hardest part was surviving the Sunday dinners. Sabrina insisted on maintaining our weekly family meals at the main house under the guise of keeping the family together during our period of shared grief. In reality, she was transforming the massive mahogany dining table into a hostile interrogation room. She would sit at the head of the table pouring expensive red wine and slicing into roasted meats while meticulously dissecting my sanity in front of an audience. Her attacks were always disguised as profound maternal concern. She would stop chewing, rest her silver fork on the edge of her porcelain plate, and look at me with wide, sorrowful eyes. She would ask how many hours I had slept the night before. She would lean forward and softly inquire if I had remembered to take the herbal sleep supplements she had sent to my apartment. She would remark on how incredibly pale my skin looked under the dining room chandelier. Then she would drop the heaviest anchor of all. She would reach out, gently touch my wrist, and ask if I was still hearing my father walking down the upstairs hallway at night. It was a brilliant and utterly ruthless tactic. If I vehemently denied hearing ghosts, I would sound defensive and agitated. If I simply stared at my plate in silence, my lack of response was immediately interpreted as a catatonic symptom of deep depression. So I chose the middle ground. I offered weak, uncertain smiles. I mumbled vague answers about being tired. I let my shoulders slump. I gave her exactly the kind of pathetic, broken performance she desperately needed to validate her narrative. But Sabrina did not rely solely on her own theatrical performances. She enlisted professional mercenaries. Dr. Peter Solis was a prominent figure in the local high society circuit. He was a psychiatrist who spent far more time attending wealthy charity galas than he ever did sitting in a clinical office treating actual patients. Sabrina had served on 3 different philanthropic hospital boards with him. Without ever conducting a single formal medical evaluation, without ever sitting alone with me in a quiet room, and without ever asking for my comprehensive medical history, Dr. Solis began generating formal letters of professional concern. He based his alarming written observations entirely on the carefully curated anecdotes Sabrina fed him over expensive lunches. He drafted letters suggesting I was exhibiting severe signs of prolonged complicated grief disorder and acute cognitive dissociation. He used heavy clinical terminology to describe a woman he had only briefly spoken to while standing near an open bar at a country club fundraiser. His medical license gave Sabrina the exact weapon she needed to legitimize her gossip. She made sure those informal but terrifying notes found their way into the hands of our extended family. The isolation was absolute, and it was suffocating. Aunt Marcy began calling my cellular phone every single afternoon. Before my father passed away, Marcy and I used to talk about the stock market and city politics. Now she spoke to me using the sickeningly sweet, high-pitched tone you would use to address a frightened toddler. She would ask what I had eaten for lunch and tell me to make sure I drank enough water. Other cousins and distant relatives followed the exact same pattern. They treated me like a piece of incredibly fragile crystal that was already vibrating at the exact frequency required to shatter. No one asked me about the shipping company. No one asked me about the upcoming city council rezoning vote. They had all completely accepted the premise that my brain was broken and I was no longer capable of participating in the adult corporate world. Playing the role of the passive victim was the most exhausting labor I have ever undertaken in my entire life. I had to swallow every single instinct I possessed. When Sabrina told a blatant lie about my behavior in front of the family, I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper to keep from screaming. I nodded when I was told to nod. I smiled weakly when I was expected to smile. I offered absolutely zero resistance. My total compliance made Sabrina arrogant. She became so incredibly confident in her own script that she stopped looking for the strings I was quietly pulling behind the curtain. But the internal toll was devastating. While I played the hollow ghost during the daylight hours, the nights were a brutal physical battle. I suffered from crippling insomnia. I would lay awake in my cramped apartment staring at the water stains on the ceiling while my heart hammered violently against my ribs. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the panic would set in. The sheer weight of what I was attempting to pull off would press down on my chest until I could barely draw a breath. There were countless nights where I stood in the middle of my small kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter with white knuckles, fighting the overwhelming urge to completely destroy the room. I wanted to sweep the dishes onto the floor. I wanted to drive straight to the massive family estate, kick down the heavy front door, and scream the truth into Sabrina's perfectly made-up face. I was running on empty, fueled entirely by adrenaline and cold black coffee. Then one rainy Tuesday night, everything finally shifted into crystal-clear focus. I was sitting at my cheap plastic folding table surrounded by scattered digital forensic reports. I had retrieved a heavy cardboard box of my father's old personal electronics from the company storage facility earlier that week. Inside was an outdated tablet computer he had stopped using nearly 2 years ago. The screen was cracked and the battery was completely dead. It took me nearly 3 hours of carefully splicing charging cables and bypassing outdated security protocols to force the ancient machine to power up. I was not looking for anything specific. I was merely performing a routine data sweep out of sheer desperate habit. I accessed his old local email client. It had not synced to the internet in over 18 months. Deep inside the drafts folder, hidden beneath dozens of unsent replies to shipping contractors, I found a single incomplete message addressed to his private estate attorney. I sat alone in the dark listening to the rain beat against the thin glass of my apartment window and read the words my father had typed. The message was brief and it carried the weight of an absolute revelation. He wrote that his health was failing faster than the doctors were willing to admit. He instructed his attorney to ensure the trust was ironclad regarding the East Nashville property. Then came the final sentence. A sentence that made my breath catch in my throat. He explicitly wrote that if Sabrina ever attempted to force a premature sale of the freight yard before the final city rezoning vote took place, I was to delay the transaction at all absolute costs. I read those words over and over again. My eyes burned and my vision blurred, but I refused to let the tears fall. That single unsent draft changed the entire landscape of the war. For weeks I had believed my father was simply a naive old man who had been completely blinded by a beautiful, manipulative woman. I thought he had rewritten his trust merely as a standard financial precaution. But this hidden digital fragment proved something entirely different. He knew. He had seen the quiet, monstrous greed lurking beneath her perfectly tailored dresses and bright smiles. His realization had simply arrived far too late for him to fight the battle himself. He was not just trying to protect a lucrative piece of real estate. He was trying to protect me. He knew exactly what she was capable of doing to secure that staggering wealth, and he had intentionally built a legal fortress around me right before he died. He handed me the shield and the sword, because he knew I was the only one in the family strong enough to actually wield them. The crippling anxiety that had been suffocating me for weeks instantly evaporated. The heavy crushing weight in my chest dissolved, leaving nothing but cold, calculated clarity. I finally understood the absolute truth of my situation. This was not a tragic story about a greedy, grieving widow trying to steal a few extra dollars from the family accounts. This was a highly orchestrated, hostile domestic takeover. It was an aggressive psychological assassination campaign, meticulously wrapped in the soft, comforting language of maternal pity. Sabrina wanted to erase my entire existence and replace it with a profitable narrative of insanity. I carefully backed up the drafted email onto a secure encrypted drive. I turned off the cracked tablet and sat in the dark silence of my apartment. I was no longer exhausted. I was no longer afraid of the upcoming court date. The trap was fully set. The evidence was locked, and my father had just given me his final blessing from beyond the grave. Sabrina thought she was walking into a courtroom to put down a sick animal. She had absolutely no idea she had just locked herself inside a cage with a predator who was finally ready to eat. When the official petition for an emergency conservatorship finally landed on the docket, it was a masterpiece of legal fiction. Sabrina did not merely ask the court to monitor my personal health. Her filing contained a highly specific secondary motion requesting the immediate and temporary transfer of my corporate voting shares at the logistics company. She argued that the enterprise was bleeding cash so rapidly that the court needed to install her as the proxy voter to stop the financial hemorrhage. The evidentiary binder her legal team submitted to the court clerk was thick enough to break a toe if you dropped it. It contained 4 primary pillars of fabricated evidence. The first was a heavily doctored financial summary outlining the massive sudden cash losses I was allegedly causing. The second was a digital audio drive containing heavily spliced recordings of my telephone calls designed to make my voice sound frantic and disjointed. The third was a formal affidavit from Dr. Peter Solis, packed with dense, terrifying medical terminology about my supposed cognitive collapse. But the absolute crown jewel of her filing was the fourth pillar. It was a document titled as an emergency power of attorney. It claimed my father had signed it shortly before his hospital admission, granting Sabrina the overriding authority to manage the business assets if I ever proved incapable. A lesser attorney would have immediately panicked upon seeing that mountain of paper. A flashy corporate lawyer would have immediately called a press conference or filed a dozen loud, angry countermotions screaming about fraud. But Nina Barrett operated on a completely different frequency. She did not waste a single drop of ink complaining about the injustice of it all. Instead, she picked up her scalpel. She utilized incredibly narrow, legally binding subpoenas directed at specific internet service providers and corporate registry offices. She bypassed the loud arguments and went straight for the structural integrity of the documents themselves. We sat in her small bakery-scented office and began pulling the threads one by one. Our first target was the trio of ghost vendors draining the company accounts. We pulled the original articles of organization filed with the Secretary of State. All three limited liability companies were registered on the exact same Tuesday afternoon. They all utilized the exact same registered agent, but Nina dug even deeper into the boring administrative filings. She pulled the mandatory commercial liability insurance certificates for the three vendors. They were exact carbon copies of each other down to a specific bizarre typographical error regarding water damage on the fourth page. We traced the physical mailing address listed on the tax forms. It was not a commercial warehouse. It was a tiny metal postal box located inside a failing strip mall. We ran the property records for that strip mall and found it was owned by a subsidiary holding company entirely managed by Nolan Voss. The financial theft was now undeniably linked directly to Sabrina's real estate broker. But the financial fraud was only the warm-up act. The real blood was found inside the emergency power of attorney document. Sabrina and Dean Ralston had submitted a beautifully printed PDF file to the court, complete with my father's signature. The date printed next to the signature was allegedly 2 weeks before his fatal surgery. But paper lies. Digital forensics do not. Nina filed a quiet sealed motion, compelling the opposing counsel to provide the native electronic file for standard evidentiary review. When they complied, thinking it was merely a routine procedural request, they handed us the murder weapon. I ran the native file through my forensic extraction software. The hidden metadata told a very different story than the printed ink. The digital creation date of the file was exactly 6 days after my father took his final breath. You cannot draft a legally binding contract when you are already buried under 6 feet of dirt. Furthermore, the machine authoring the file left a permanent digital fingerprint. The document was not created on my father's home computer. It was authored and saved on a desktop terminal officially registered to the private internet network of Ralston and Pike Legal Group. The realization that the document originated directly from Dean's law firm changed the entire weight of the battlefield. Up until that exact moment, I had assumed Dean Ralston was simply a highly paid, arrogant attorney who blindly believed the sweet lies his beautiful client was feeding him. Lawyers are often manipulated by their own clients. It is a common professional hazard, but the digital fingerprint proving the forgery was cooked right inside his own office meant he was not a pawn. He was an active, malicious co-conspirator. He was risking his entire legal career, his license to practice law, and his own freedom to help Sabrina steal my inheritance. That level of risk meant Nolan Voss had likely promised Dean a massive hidden percentage of the final real estate flip. The sheer greed infecting the people around me was absolutely breathtaking. They were all circling the massive East Nashville freight yard, like starving vultures entirely willing to destroy my life for a piece of the meat. The arrogance of their operation was staggering. They were moving so incredibly fast to secure the land deal before the rezoning vote that they became unforgivably sloppy with their administrative details. We found another glaring error buried in the supporting affidavits. One of the sworn statements corroborating the timeline of the power of attorney was officially stamped by a local notary public. The physical stamp looked perfectly legitimate at first glance. But Nina, being the meticulous predator she was, cross-referenced the notary commission number with the state database. The license for that specific notary had officially expired 4 months prior to the date written on the document. The stamp was completely legally void. But the single most chilling discovery did not come from a computer server or a state registry. It came from Nina simply reading the text of the emergency power of attorney out loud. She was pacing across her small office reading the specific clauses when she suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She lowered the paper and stared blankly at the wall. She read a specific phrase out loud again. It stated that the transfer of power was necessary due to an immediate danger to asset dissipation in the respondent's best interest. I asked her what was wrong with the sentence. She slowly looked at me and explained that the phrasing was completely unnatural for a standard corporate succession document. Business attorneys do not write like that. That specific combination of words was highly proprietary judicial language. It was the exact kind of obscure, heavy terminology a sitting chancery court judge uses when drafting a highly restrictive, sealed protective order regarding contested estates. It did not read like a contract. It read like someone had illegally accessed a private judicial template from a completely different restricted case and hastily copied and pasted the heavy legal jargon into our family document to make it sound more official. A cold thrill ran down my spine. This was the fatal flaw. If we presented this evidence immediately in a pretrial motion, Dean Ralston would instantly recognize the danger. He would claim a paralegal made a terrible filing error. He would quietly withdraw the forged documents, apologize to the court, and pivot to a different legal strategy. The trap would snap shut on empty air. I looked at Nina and told her we were going to bury the forensic reports. We would not include a single word about the metadata, the expired notary, or the copied judicial phrasing in our official response brief. We were going to let Sabrina and Dean walk into that courtroom completely unchallenged. We needed them to physically hand those documents to the judge. We needed Dean to confidently argue their absolute validity on the permanent court record. We needed Sabrina to raise her right hand and swear to God that her dead husband had signed that specific piece of paper, because once they did that, the entire nature of the war would instantly transform. It would no longer be a messy domestic dispute about a grieving daughter and a concerned stepmother fighting over a freight yard. By submitting a manufactured document containing stolen judicial language, they were elevating their crime. They were about to commit an act of absolute brazen disrespect directly against the integrity of the court itself. And there is nothing a seasoned judge hates more than a lawyer who thinks they are smart enough to use the court's own words to commit a robbery right inside the courtroom. I was holding the ultimate silver bullet, and I intended to wait until they were standing point blank before I finally pulled the trigger. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the room was completely stagnant, smelling faintly of old paper and bitter anticipation. Sabrina glided down the center aisle wearing a flawlessly tailored cream-colored suit. The pale fabric caught the harsh fluorescent overhead light, making her look almost angelic to the untrained eye. But my eyes immediately locked onto her left wrist. She was wearing my father's vintage silver timepiece. The heavy metal band hung slightly loose on her delicate arm, but she wore it exactly like a conqueror displaying the absolute spoils of a violent war. Every single time she moved her hand, the watch flashed a brilliant silver warning across the room. She was silently broadcasting absolute ownership over our entire family legacy, before anyone had even spoken a single word into the official record. Dean Ralston approached the wooden podium with the slow, reluctant, heavy steps of a man allegedly carrying a terrible moral burden. He meticulously arranged his expensive leather binder, snapping the metal rings shut with a sharp echo. He looked up at Judge Hal Reed with an expression of profound manufactured sorrow. His opening statement was a masterclass in hypocritical piety. He began by explicitly stating that absolutely no one in the family wanted to be standing inside this courtroom today. He painted the entire proceeding as a tragic, unavoidable necessity forced upon a loving stepmother. He claimed that taking legal action against me was completely tearing his client apart, but out of deep, profound familial love and absolute financial responsibility, Sabrina was forced to beg the court for immediate intervention. He did not shout or pound his fist on the wood. He spoke softly, using the gentle, weary tone of a disappointed parent, making his character assassination sound entirely like a desperate act of mercy. He expertly laid the foundation, framing me not as a calculating villain, but as a tragic victim of my own collapsing mind. Then they called their so-called expert to the stand. Dr. Peter Solis sat down in the witness chair, carefully smoothing the lapels of his dark gray designer jacket. He exuded an overwhelming air of detached clinical authority. When Dean asked him to evaluate my mental state, Dr. Solis did not look at me once. He refused to make eye contact with the woman he was actively attempting to destroy. He looked directly at the judge and unleashed a terrifying avalanche of vague but completely devastating medical terminology. He confidently diagnosed me from across the room using heavy, terrifying words, like cognitive disorder, prolonged grief reaction, and acute dissociative symptoms. He testified that based on his extensive professional observations, I was suffering from a severe emotional detachment that rendered me completely incapable of making rational daily decisions. He solemnly warned the court that leaving a woman in my highly precarious mental state in charge of a massive logistics empire was a catastrophic financial and physical risk. He painted a terrifying, vivid picture of a fragile mind ready to completely snap under the immense, crushing pressure of high-stakes corporate finance. But the doctor was merely the sterile clinical appetizer. Sabrina was the emotional main course. She took the official oath, raising her right hand with practiced grace, and sat down, adjusting the microphone with trembling fingers. She took a deep, shaky breath and began recounting a series of polished, heavily rehearsed little tragedies. She took the incredibly normal, raw symptoms of human grief and weaponized them into undeniable hard evidence of severe pathology. She told the court about a Tuesday evening where I completely forgot to eat dinner, staring blankly at the kitchen wall. She described a Thursday morning where I accidentally mixed up the days of the week, missing a routine dental appointment. She testified that I routinely ignored urgent business emails for 3 or 4 hours at a time, sitting alone in the dark. I sat there listening to her completely rewrite my reality. The sheer audacity of her lies was almost mesmerizing. She took the most agonizing days of my life and turned them into a cheap theatrical script for her own personal financial gain. I had to focus entirely on the grain of the wood on the table in front of me to keep my face completely blank. The most sickening moment of her entire performance was when she described finding me standing alone in the backyard. She lowered her voice to a fragile, tearful whisper that echoed perfectly through the silent room. She claimed she had watched me standing completely motionless by the old oak tree for over 45 minutes, completely unresponsive to the freezing wind biting at my skin. She made a quiet, private moment of mourning my dead father sound exactly like a severe catatonic break from reality. The entire room fell into a dead, heavy silence. You could physically feel the collective oxygen being sucked right out of the space. They were successfully taking every single tear I had shed, every quiet moment I had spent missing my father, and weaving them into a tight, suffocating straitjacket. The gallery behind me believed every single word. I could see Aunt Marcy and my cousins nodding slowly with tragic understanding out of the corner of my eye. The senior board member in the back row was furiously writing notes on a yellow legal pad. They all fully believed I was a derailed train completely crashing off the tracks. Judge Reed sat back in his high leather chair, slowly steepling his fingers together. He had listened to the entire suffocating performance with a completely unreadable expression. He slowly turned his head and looked directly down at me from his elevated bench. The courtroom went entirely still. The silence was absolute and terrifying. It was the kind of heavy quiet that makes your own pulse pound loudly in your ears. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and asked me if I had anything to say in response to these incredibly grave allegations. Across the aisle, the entire opposing table completely froze. Sabrina stopped pretending to wipe her eyes with her pristine white tissue. Dean Ralston leaned forward slightly, bracing his hands against the heavy wooden table. They were all holding their collective breath, absolutely desperate for me to make a fatal, unrecoverable mistake. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to passionately call Sabrina a liar. They wanted my voice to crack and my hands to shake uncontrollably. Any sudden burst of righteous anger would instantly validate the doctor's diagnosis of emotional instability. They were praying for a fiery public explosion to permanently seal my fate. I did not give them fire. I gave them absolute freezing ice. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back without making a single sound. I did not rush the movement. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs completely before I opened my mouth. I looked past Sabrina, past her expensive lawyer, and focused entirely on the judge. My body language was perfectly rigid. I kept my hands resting casually by my sides, displaying absolutely zero physical tension. My voice was incredibly calm, flat, and entirely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. I addressed the court with the precise, calculated tone of a machine reading a corporate bank ledger. I told the judge that I respectfully requested permission to structure my formal response in 3 highly specific consecutive layers. I stated that I would first address the missing money. Second, I would address the professional credibility of the medical witness. And third, I would address the physical documents currently sitting on his desk. The sheer mechanical coldness of my response sent a visible ripple of deep confusion through the room. My extreme unnatural composure completely threw them off balance. Aunt Marcy exchanged a worried, terrified glance with her daughter. Sabrina actually relaxed her shoulders, sinking slightly back into her chair with a look of arrogant triumph washing over her face. In her completely twisted mind, my completely flat affect and total lack of outrage proved exactly what they were claiming. She truly thought my emotional paralysis was undeniable proof that I was completely broken and incapable of fighting back. Judge Reed studied my face for a very long, quiet moment. His dark, piercing eyes searched for any hidden cracks in my armor. Finding absolutely none, he gave a single slow nod of his head. He formally granted my request and instructed me to proceed with my first layer. Sabrina offered a tiny, almost invisible smirk, hiding it perfectly behind her tissue. Dean crossed his arms over his chest, looking entirely bored. Neither of them realized the catastrophic, unfixable mistake they had just made. They thought they had successfully pushed me into a dark, helpless corner. They had absolutely no idea that they had just willingly handed me the entire stage, and the curtain was about to violently rise on their total, absolute destruction. I picked up the heavy leather binder resting on my table. I also grabbed a small silver flash drive. I walked slowly across the completely silent courtroom toward the elevated wooden bench. The rhythmic click of my flat shoes against the polished floor sounded incredibly loud. I handed the heavy stack of paper and the small digital drive directly to the court clerk, who passed them up to Judge Reed. I did not return to my seat. I stood entirely straight in the center of the room and looked directly at the man holding the gavel. I began with the absolute bottom line. I told the court that exactly $486,200 had been systematically drained from the primary corporate operating fund over the past 4 months. I stated that this massive sum of money did not disappear through poor management or economic downturns. It vanished through exactly 63 highly specific individual wire transfers. I watched Dean Ralston stiffen in his chair. He was expecting a tearful defense of my sanity. He was absolutely not expecting a forensic accounting presentation. I explained to the judge that those 63 transactions were not executed randomly. They were mathematically perfectly timed. They occurred in tight, aggressive clusters exactly 48 hours before our internal monthly financial reporting deadlines. I pointed out that someone was deliberately engineering a severe cash flow crisis right before the corporate accountants generated the balance sheets. They were bleeding the company dry on a highly specific schedule, specifically to manufacture the exact financial disaster they were currently blaming on my supposed mental collapse. Judge Reed flipped open the heavy binder. His eyes scanned the top page. He asked me how I could prove these transfers were malicious and not simply routine business expenditures paid at the end of the month. That was the exact question I needed him to ask. I directed his attention to tab 3 in the binder. I explained that I had pulled the server access logs for the internal corporate payment portal. I did not just look at the usernames attached to the wire transfers, because usernames can easily be stolen or spoofed. I looked at the raw Internet Protocol addresses and the hidden Wi-Fi access logs. I stated clearly for the official record that over 80% of those 63 fraudulent transfer commands originated from a specific residential Internet router. That router belonged to the massive estate where Sabrina currently resided. Sabrina physically jolted in her chair. The flawless cream suit suddenly looked a little less perfect. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I continued without missing a single beat. I told the court that the remaining 20% of the fraudulent transfers were executed using a mobile cellular hotspot. I had legally cross-referenced the device registration logs. That specific mobile hotspot belonged to a cellular phone registered to Nolan Voss. The same Nolan Voss, who was currently sitting quietly in the very last row of the courtroom trying to blend into the heavy oak paneling. I did not turn around to look at him, but I could feel the sudden violent shift in the atmospheric pressure behind me. Dean Ralston scrambled to his feet, objecting loudly. He claimed this evidence was completely unverified and entirely outside the scope of a conservatorship hearing. He stammered that his client was simply paying legitimate vendors for necessary environmental cleanup and site security. I turned slightly to face Dean, keeping my voice entirely deadpan. I told him to look at tab 4. I addressed the room, explaining that Red Hollow Environmental Pine Harbor Site Control and Slate Anchor Advisory were completely hollow phantoms. I had pulled the State Transportation Department records. Not a single one of those 3 companies owned a commercial truck. I pulled the State Environmental Licensing Board records. None of them held the mandatory hazardous material handling permits required to legally step foot on an industrial freight yard. They had absolutely 0 payroll records and 0 registered employees. Their entire corporate existence consisted solely of beautifully designed graphic invoices and a single metal post office box located inside a failing strip mall. They were stealing almost $500,000 to clean dirt they had never even seen. The silence in the room was no longer the heavy quiet of anticipation. It was the sharp ringing silence of absolute shock. Then I dropped the largest hammer of them all. I told Judge Reed to turn to the final tab in the binder, the tab containing the ultimate endgame. I explained that the stolen cash was merely the theatrical smoke used to hide the actual fire. I revealed that exactly 2 weeks ago, a new commercial legal entity named Crescent Basin Redevelopment Limited Liability Company had quietly filed a massive purchase option contract with the county clerk. They had placed a completely unsolicited predatory bid to purchase the entire 38-acre East Nashville freight yard. The purchase price listed on that hidden contract was insultingly low. It was a fraction of what the raw dirt was actually worth. I laid the entire brutal architecture of their conspiracy completely bare under the harsh courtroom lights. I explained the exact sequence of events. First, they drained the corporate cash reserves to create a terrifying internal panic. Second, they blamed the missing money on my supposed cognitive decline. Third, they dragged me into this exact courtroom to strip away my legal autonomy and steal my corporate voting rights. Fourth, Sabrina uses her newly acquired conservatorship power to forcefully accept that predatory lowball offer on behalf of the logistics company. And finally, once the City Council approves the massive transit rezoning vote next week, Crescent Basin Redevelopment instantly flips the land for hundreds of millions of dollars. They keep the massive profit margin entirely for themselves, leaving my family legacy completely gutted. I pointed out that Crescent Basin Redevelopment was legally organized by the exact same registered agent who set up the 3 fake vendor companies. It was a closed loop of absolute financial theft. In the second row of the gallery, the senior board member suddenly stood up. His face was entirely drained of color. His expensive briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a loud, heavy thud. He was staring directly at Dean Ralston with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the secure electronic signatures he had been trusting on the monthly executive summaries had been completely manipulated right under his own nose for months. The entire corporate board had been blindly marching toward a massive financial slaughter, and I was the only person who had actually read the map. The immaculate illusion of the grieving stepmother completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Sabrina could no longer hide behind her pristine tissue and her fake tears. The panic completely overrode her carefully practiced legal discipline. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands down flat on the wooden table and jumped to her feet. She screamed at me across the room. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with absolute raw fury. She completely abandoned the soft, fragile tone she had used all morning. She yelled that I was an ungrateful, paranoid child who did not understand how the real world worked. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and shouted into the official court record that my father had actively wanted her to step in. She screamed that Graham knew I was too weak to run an empire and he specifically wanted her to protect the company from my pathetic emotional decisions. She thought her anger sounded righteous. She thought she was defending her own honor, but all I heard was the sharp metallic click of the trap finally snapping shut on her own leg. Judge Reed slammed his heavy wooden gavel down twice, demanding absolute order in his courtroom. The sharp echoing cracks forced Sabrina to stop screaming, but she remained standing, her chest heaving heavily as she glared at me with pure venom. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply let her words hang in the freezing courtroom air. She had just publicly claimed, under the strict penalty of perjury, that my father had wanted her to take control and bypass my authority. She had just explicitly tied her entire moral and legal justification directly to the desires of a dead man. She had just willingly, completely unforced, opened the heavy iron door for the final devastating blow. I turned back to the judge and stated that my stepmother had just made a very bold claim about my father and his final wishes. The echo of Sabrina screaming that Graham wanted her in control was still vibrating violently against the cold walls. I let the silence stretch for exactly 10 seconds. I wanted every single person in the room to fully digest the absolute magnitude of her arrogance. Then I shifted my entire focus away from the stolen cash and aimed my weapon directly at her primary motive. I told the court that we did not need to guess what my father wanted because he had written his exact intentions down himself. I instructed Judge Reed to look at the next exhibit in the binder. It was a certified physical printout of the recovered digital draft I had pulled from his old broken tablet. I read my father's own words aloud to the quiet room. I read the specific sentence where he explicitly warned his estate attorney that Sabrina possessed a highly dangerous tendency to liquidate incredibly valuable family assets for quick, immediate cash. I read the exact unyielding clause where he legally mandated that absolutely no portion of the East Nashville freight yard could be sold or transferred under any circumstances until after the city council finalized the rezoning vote. He knew her true terrifying nature long before his heart failed. He intentionally built a massive legal firewall to block her out, and he trusted me entirely to hold the line. That was the real reason she desperately needed me. Declared mentally incompetent today. She was completely locked out of a multi-million-dollar payday, and I was the absolute only person holding the keys to the vault. Sabrina slowly sank back down into her wooden chair. Her face was completely drained of its fake righteous anger, leaving behind nothing but a pale, sickly terror. I did not stop there. I turned my body slightly to face the witness box. Dr. Peter Solis was gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. I asked the court to carefully examine the financial records regarding the good doctor. I pointed out that a standard independent medical evaluation is typically billed through a licensed medical clinic or a formal hospital administration department. However, the heavy invoice for his incredibly detailed psychological assessment of my character was never processed by any actual medical facility. Instead, it was paid directly out of a private philanthropic charity fund, completely controlled by Sabrina. She did not pay for a medical diagnosis. She explicitly purchased a customized hit piece using tax-deductible charity money. Dr. Solis opened his mouth to object, but I immediately cut him off by directing the judge to the next page in the forensic binder. I stated that the terrifying clinical language he used to describe my supposed dissociative breakdown was remarkably eloquent. It was so eloquent, in fact, that it matched almost word for word with a free online training template designed for first-year college psychology students studying standard grief responses. I had run his official sworn medical affidavit through a standard academic plagiarism checker. Entire heavy paragraphs were lifted directly from the internet without a single grammatical alteration. I watched the highly prestigious doctor visibly shrink in his seat. His immaculate professional reputation was completely disintegrating right in front of the entire gallery. He was nothing but a highly paid actor reciting stolen internet lines. Dean Ralston scrambled frantically from his chair, shouting a rapid sequence of loud, aggressive objections. He threw his hands in the air, claiming I was wildly speculating and conducting an unauthorized cross-examination without following proper legal procedure. His voice was entirely stripped of its smooth professional baritone. He sounded like a desperate cornered animal fighting for its life. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on Judge Reed and spoke right over Dean. I told the judge that opposing counsel was entirely correct to be angry and panicked because we had finally arrived at the absolute most dangerous document in the entire room. I instructed the judge to turn to the emergency power of attorney. This was the exact document Sabrina and Dean had repeatedly used as the entire moral and legal foundation for this hostile courtroom proceeding. It was the specific piece of paper that supposedly gave her absolute control over my entire life. I calmly explained that a certified forensic document examiner had completely dismantled the digital file they submitted. I laid out the brutal, indisputable facts. The signature belonging to my father was not signed with a physical pen. It was a digital image perfectly cropped from an old mundane warehouse lease contract from exactly 5 years ago. Someone had used standard commercial photo editing software to seamlessly paste that old signature onto the new emergency power of attorney. Even worse, the hidden metadata embedded deep inside the file proved conclusively that the document was completely generated and saved exactly 6 days after my father was officially pronounced dead by the hospital. Dean slammed his hands down hard on his table. He shouted wildly that the metadata was somehow corrupted. He stammered frantically that his highly respected law firm would never engage in criminal document manipulation. He was sweating profusely, and his expensive tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. I took one final step forward, closing the physical distance between myself and the judge. The entire courtroom felt like it was tilting violently on its axis. The air grew incredibly heavy, dark, and utterly suffocating. I was dialing up the pressure until the very walls felt like they were bleeding. I lowered my voice, speaking with a quiet, absolute certainty that cut cleanly through the desperate noise of Dean shouting. I told Judge Reed that the forged signature and the impossible chronological timeline were not even the most egregious crimes committed in his courtroom this morning. I asked him to closely examine the highly specific legal phrasing used in the 4th paragraph of their forged document. I asked him to look at the unique structure of the footer printed at the very bottom of the page. I stated clearly that my forensic data team had run a comprehensive comparative linguistic analysis on the specific jargon used in that exact paragraph. The phrase regarding the immediate danger to asset dissipation in the respondent's best interest was not standard corporate law language. I told the entire silent room that those specific words, that exact unique grammatical structure, and that highly specific footer layout belonged entirely to a heavily restricted sealed protective order. I paused intentionally, letting the terrible silence stretch tightly across the room like a piano wire. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I told Judge Reed that the sealed protective order they had illegally plagiarized was originally authored and issued directly from his very own judicial chambers in a completely unrelated case. Dean completely stopped talking. He froze exactly where he stood, his mouth hanging slightly open in pure horror. Sabrina squeezed her eyes shut tightly as if she could somehow block out the terrifying reality of what was happening. In the back row, Nolan Voss tried to quietly stand up and slip toward the rear exit, but a heavy-set courtroom bailiff immediately stepped directly into the aisle, blocking his path with a single slight shift of his massive shoulders. At the front of the room, Judge Hal Reed completely stopped moving. He did not look down at Dean. He did not look across at Sabrina. He slowly picked up the fraudulent power of attorney document with both hands and held it perfectly still in the air. He stared at the printed words for what felt like an absolute eternity. The color of the room seemed to violently shift from a sterile fluorescent white to a deep bruised shadow. The sheer weight of the insult was almost physical. They had not just tried to steal my family inheritance. They had actively hacked into the sacred architecture of the legal system and tried to use this specific judge's own private words to commit a multi-million-dollar felony right to his face. Judge Reed slowly lowered the piece of paper back onto his heavy wooden desk. He reached up with slow, deliberate fingers and pulled his reading glasses off his face. He folded the arms of the glasses with a sharp, highly audible snap. When he finally looked up, his eyes were no longer neutral or exhausted. They were completely black cold and radiating a terrifying absolute authority. In that single microscopic moment, the entire pathetic theatrical play they had constructed completely collapsed into dust. Judge Hal Reed did not put his reading glasses back on. He held them loosely in his right hand, allowing the folded frames to rest against the polished wood of his heavy desk. He did not need the lenses to read the fraudulent document sitting in front of him, because the words were already permanently burned into his memory. His voice, completely devoid of the tired neutrality he had displayed all morning, rolled across the silent courtroom like a low warning thunder. He recited the specific legal phrasing entirely from memory without looking down at the paper. He spoke the exact words regarding the immediate danger to asset dissipation in the respondent's best interest. When he finished reciting the sentence, he leaned forward. He locked his dark eyes directly onto Dean Ralston. He stated that he recognized that highly specific string of words because he was the one who had personally drafted it. He explained that exactly 2 years ago he presided over a highly sensitive conservatorship case involving a vulnerable ward. Because of the extreme privacy required, he had manually edited the standard protective order utilizing that exact unique phrasing. He then completely sealed that specific case file, locking it securely away from the public record. Judge Reed did not raise his voice, but the absolute deadly calm in his tone was far more terrifying than any loud shout. He asked Dean a very simple, direct question. He demanded to know exactly how proprietary language from a sealed judicial record managed to crawl out of the locked court archives and onto a private family document submitted by his prestigious law firm. He asked who precisely had illegally accessed the sealed files. Dean stood completely frozen behind his desk. The arrogant, impeccably dressed lawyer who had strutted into the room earlier that morning was completely gone. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound emerged. The silence that stretched across the courtroom was excruciating. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man actively realizing his entire professional career. His license to practice law and his personal freedom were completely evaporating right in front of his eyes. Sabrina sat completely rigid next to him. All the fake blood had completely drained from her flawless face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. She looked like a ghost who had just realized she was already dead. She instinctively reached up and grabbed the vintage silver watch on her wrist, gripping the metal band so tightly, her knuckles turned entirely white. In the very last row of the wooden gallery, the panic finally overwhelmed Nolan Voss. He slowly stood up, trying to keep his movements incredibly small and completely invisible. He took one quiet step toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. He did not make it to his second step. The large uniformed bailiff who had been standing silently by the wall merely shifted his considerable weight, leaning his broad shoulders directly into the narrow aisle. The bailiff did not draw a weapon or say a single word. He just offered a cold, hard stare that communicated an absolute, undeniable physical boundary. Nolan slowly sank back down into his wooden bench, swallowing hard as the invisible trap completely closed around him. Judge Reed did not wait for Dean to miraculously find his voice. The judge had seen absolutely everything he needed to see. He sat up completely straight, radiating the terrifying, unyielding power of the American judicial system. He announced his formal ruling directly into the official court record. He stated with absolute finality that the court found absolutely zero credible medical or behavioral evidence to suggest that I was suffering from any form of cognitive decline. He declared me entirely legally competent and fully capable of managing my own personal and financial affairs. He then picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He stated that the petition for an emergency conservatorship was completely dismissed, but he did not stop there. He added the two most devastating words a petitioner can ever hear in a civil courtroom. He dismissed the case with prejudice. Those two words were a massive iron vault slamming shut forever. They meant Sabrina was permanently barred from ever bringing this specific case or these fabricated allegations before any court ever again. Her beautifully crafted theatrical play was completely canceled. The gavel cracked down against the sounding block with a sharp, violent echo that made Sabrina physically flinch, but Judge Reed was far from finished. He immediately issued a binding emergency judicial order directing the immediate freezing of all commercial bank accounts remotely associated with Red Hollow Environmental Pine Harbor Site Control Slate Anchor, Advisory and Crescent Basin Redevelopment Limited Liability Company. He explicitly stated that those assets were to be completely preserved pending a massive criminal investigation. He looked directly at Sabrina and then at Dean. He announced that he was officially transferring the entire case file, the digital forensic reports, and the forged documents directly to the district attorney. He listed the impending criminal referrals with the methodical precision of an executioner sharpening a blade. He cited perjury fraud on the court, submitting a forged instrument, criminal conspiracy, and gross abuse of the judicial process. He then added a final terrifying layer, noting that because the stolen corporate funds were routed through digital wire transfers crossing state lines, he was also alerting the federal authorities for potential federal wire fraud violations. The courtroom gallery behind me was completely paralyzed. I did not turn my head to look at them, but I could feel the absolute tectonic shift in their collective understanding. My aunt, my cousins, and the corporate board member finally realized the devastating truth. They finally understood that they had not been standing righteously beside the stable matriarch and praying for the crazy, broken daughter. They had willingly stood on the absolute wrong side of the battlefield, blindly supporting a ruthless actor simply because she cried prettier tears. They had actively participated in my psychological torture until the hard, undeniable forensic evidence violently forced their eyes wide open. The formal hearing adjourned, leaving a trail of absolute destruction in its wake. I walked out of the heavy courtroom doors and stepped into the long, echoing marble hallway. The air out there felt incredibly thin and remarkably clean. Aunt Marcy was waiting for me near the elevators. Her hands were shaking violently. Her eyes were red and completely swollen with genuine tears of deep shame. She stepped forward, her voice trembling as she offered a desperate, fragmented apology. She told me she was so incredibly sorry she had believed the lies. She raised her arms slightly, clearly wanting to pull me into a tight, forgiving embrace. I did not step forward. I kept my distance, keeping my hands completely relaxed by my sides. I looked at her with the exact same cold, steady gaze I had used inside the courtroom. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure my words carried a weight she would never forget. I told her that absolute trust always carries a very specific price tag. And I softly explained that the price becomes devastatingly high when you willingly hand your trust over to someone who views human pity as nothing more than a strategic financial investment tool. I left her standing entirely alone in the marble hallway, her arms hovering uselessly in the empty air. Exactly 11 days later, the highly anticipated City Council meeting took place. The massive transit rezoning initiative was officially passed by a unanimous vote. The exact second the mayor signed the zoning ordinance, the market value of the 38-acre East Nashville freight yard completely skyrocketed. It multiplied exponentially, turning my father's heavy dirt into an absolute unassailable fortune. That was the moment the final brilliant layer of Sabrina's failed master plan became completely clear to the rest of the world. She was never just trying to steal a few $100,000 in fake environmental cleanup fees. She was not just trying to steal my corporate voting rights. She was desperately trying to steal the actual timing itself. She needed to legally paralyze me before the 11th day arrived so she could swallow the entire future whole. But she failed. The fortune remained exactly where my father had placed it, securely in my hands. I did not win this brutal war because I was the loudest person in the room. I did not win by screaming my innocence or fighting desperately for validation from family members who had already abandoned me. I won because I possessed the absolute discipline to stay completely quiet in the dark. I won because I deliberately allowed Sabrina to inflate her massive, beautiful lie until it grew so incredibly large that even a tired, weary judge could clearly see the greasy fingerprints of absolute forgery smeared all over the sacred language of his own court. Thank you for listening to my story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel like this video and support us by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.